would have no idea who they are. But the ones you can track down in the Old Testament turn out to be, to say the least, very strange. That is, we've commented before on Ruth. How did she get in there? What an accident that really was. I mean, we have Abraham and we have Isaac. We have a direct line there. But Ruth wasn't in that line. She was nobody from nowhere, a Moabitess. The Moabites were the children of Hagar, weren't they? Or the cast-off children.
Yeah.
They were not part of the main line, and yet you think, but out of that came Christ our Lord. That tree of Jesse is a strange tree, and our lives are very strange.
It's not like Porphyry's tree.
No, that's right. Porphyry is the great tree of logic, isn't it? Yeah, where the system of genus and species. Yeah, that's a perfect comment, I think. No, it's filled with accident. It's filled
just
with
as the tree is. You just look at a tree. I look out the window at a tree, and you look at all those little branches there on that tree, and you say, well, it's as if it has no form at all, but it does.
But it does.
It does.
It has a root and a trunk and a branch and a twig.
Branches
And the generations of men are like the generations of the leaves. All of that is so marvelous and so true. And there's nothing that can alert us to this profound truth about everything. Nothing except poetry. Because Porphyry is quite right about his tree.
Yes.
But if you're going to deal with science, you have to leave out the accidental. You have to get to the essential, and if you want to make a definition, you don't deal with something that might have happened. You deal with what has to, with the necessity of it. So we're not disparaging Porphyry, but we're putting him in his place. The tree of Jesse is a greater tree.
It's not a living tree. The tree of Porphyry is not a living tree. It's a kind of paradigm of a tree, but not a real tree.
I was trying to find another passage, but it's somewhere in book 17. I remember that because I was reading it a few hours ago, and now I can't find it. But it was about the death of Sarpedon. I think for 20 years I pronounced that Sarpedon, but somebody told me that it's Sarpedon. You just never know how those Greek accents are going to go. But Sarpedon was a friend of Glaucus. They were about the same age, and in some way cousins. They were both from Lycia, I think. Sarpedon was the prince. But you talk about Sarpedon's lineage. He was related to Zeus. His father was Zeus. But he's killed by Patroclus in the middle of the war, and Glaucus is there. The reason I got onto it is that I was trying to track down Glaucus. Whatever became of him. He was that young man that I was talking about in my college days, of whom everyone said, well, he's brilliant. He's going to be a great poet. He's going to win the Pulitzer Prize someday. And then, as I say, I think he died. But Glaucus appears several other times in the poem, and at one time he appears at the death of Sarpedon, when Patroclus punctures him with a spear, and Sarpedon is another one of these splendid young men who dares to go against Patroclus, who is one of the great warriors and friends of Achilles. And but the thing that struck me, that I wanted to quote, was that when Sarpedon had been riding in a chariot, and when he was killed, the Homer says, and the horses. I haven't got the passage. I'll have to sort of cite. You have it?
Yeah.
The horses are focused on there. He says the horses want to run away. He calls them the sniffing horses, the snorting horses. Just you talk about accidents. That is, Homer moves away even from the people, and he just says these horses were ready because the men had leapt down from their chariots and left them loose and were fighting on the ground. And Patroclus kills Sarpedon, and Glaucus rescues his body, I think.
No, I can't find it either.
Yeah. Well, it's somewhere, as I say. Well, here, for example, is a passage. So saying, he breathed great might into the horses, and they shook the dust from their manes to the ground, and fleetly bare the swift car amid the Trojans and the Achaeans. Yeah. That's not the one I was looking for, but
those are the weeping horses of Achilles.
Is that where they are?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes,
I mean the horses.
It's actually in book 16.
Oh, you're right. You're right. It's 16. I'm sorry. I got the book wrong. Yeah. Yeah, that's what it is. I got the wrong book.
Hector pulled up his galloping horses at the Scaean gate. There, that's the horses.
Well, you see,
that's right after the death of Sarpedon.
Uh-huh. Well, what lines have you got there?
It's around 6:55.
Oh, is that late? I'm looking too early.
Right, yeah.
Now, some of you listening to this tape will say, boy, these guys are really wandering old men. But in a way, we're doing this on purpose. I mean, we didn't plan it or anything like that. But don't we want to make a parenthesis here and insist that this is the way to read a poem? That is, you and I are looking for a passage and we can't find it. Now, we might have shut the tape off here and saved feet and come on with a more organized tape. But the reason we're not shutting the tape off is that we really want to try to let anybody who doesn't know this in on a certain secret. And that is that this is the way poetry is. You can spend a half an hour looking for one passage and sometimes come upon another that you've completely forgotten and say, oh, heck with the one that I was looking for. I'm going to follow this one down. Well,
yeah, here is Glaucus does. Here, Glaucus was distraught when he heard Sarpedon's call.
That's the one.
His impotence to help him wrung his heart, and he gripped his damaged arm. With the other hand, he's been to himself, tormented as he was by the arrow wound that Tucher, fighting for his comrades' lives, had given him when he charged at the Achaean wall.
Here we have the wall.
There's the wall.
See, I mean, all of these things, and there's a line later on. It says, Patroclus had thrust a spear into Sarpedon, and Glaucus rescued him. He wasn't even dead yet, I guess. And he says that he withdrew the sword, and the black blood that flowed from his grievous wounds. I mean, if you want close-up details, that if he gave up the ghost as the spear was pulled out, a terrible image, and the blood is not red; it's black. These things are just terrible. And some god is interfering with my eyesight here. I just never want to find
Sarpedon clasped half the glittering lamps beneath his mark. The point passed harmlessly over Patroclus' left shoulder. Patroclus took the second pass, and his weapon did not leave his hand for nothing. It struck where the diaphragm comes up against the busy heart.
He knew anatomy. I mean, you're talking about a man who knew war. This is what I think. Doesn't that prove that? Yeah.
Like an oak or a poplar or a towering pine felled in the hills by men with whetted axes to make timbers for a ship, Sarpedon came to earth, groaning and clutching the dust his blood had stained. See it in his arms, stretched from his cherished horses. Even as he yielded up his life to Patroclus, he breathed defiance like some proud, tawny bull who is brought down among the shambling cows by a lion that is half heard and bellows as the lion's jaws destroy him. And then he cries out for Glaucus. Glaucus, cried Sarpedon, naming his dearest friend. Dear Glaucus, man on man.
There's that marvelous man, his dearest friend. Boy, isn't that, I mean, that's, that word beauty is so misused. But it's one paragraph later now. That's it. Line 500. Here I got it.
Yeah.
Even as he thus spoke, the end of death enfolded him, his eyes alike in his nostrils, and Patroclus, setting his foot upon his breast, drew the spear from out the flesh. Vidrith followed therewith. You just read that?
No.
No. That I see.
Drawn out.
You draw out the spear point, and the soul of Sarpedon. That is, the soul is drawn out, and the Myrmidons stayed there. The snorting horses. There are my snorting horses. I knew there was some. And the Myrmidons, that is Patroclus' troops, the men on Patroclus' side, stayed. That is, they stayed the horses. They had to hold them in. Stayed there, the snorting horses that were fain to flee, now that they had left the chariots. The snorting horses are there. That accident, Homer is really a poet. The soul of Sarpedon is drawn out with the spear, and he suddenly just, the camera, as it were, moves not only to the horses, but to their nostrils. They snort. Horses do. They go. Have you ever heard a horse do that? It's a terrifying sound. That bird is making comments on all that he knows about all this.
About accent.
I think he knows this poem a lot better than we do. But horses will snort occasionally, and this is the kind of occasion on which they do it. Oh, gee, you could write a whole book about the horses just alone. Just go through the poem. If there were a concordance to Homer, I suppose there is. Just look up horses and just go through the whole poem. What a tremendous part they play in the poem.
Well, they're everywhere in Greece. They're absolutely everywhere.
I think we've said it so many times, but I'm convinced, really, that you cannot have civilization without horses. Because they seem pretty much just machines. But how to have a portrait, civilized cheval, means horse in more advanced languages. I don't see how you can. There are people who didn't have horses, and they're barbarians. The Egyptians didn't have horses. Who were they? Hyksos or somebody or other first, remember, brought in the horses? And when you read ancient history, you hear about those people, and they came down from Ephesus or someplace. That's where they lived. In fact, I think they came down from Iraq. I think it was. But they brought the horses down, and the Egyptians were terrified of them. It was almost like Hannibal bringing the elephant. The Egyptians were conquered by these people. But the Egyptians didn't have horses. At least in those early days, they didn't have them. But when the horse came in, civilization really happened. And when the horse goes out, civilization goes out. The horse today is pretty much a circus animal. We only know in a show. They're not used this way. Real. No, again, we don't want to exaggerate. The horse is not prominent in the Iliad. The horse doesn't play a major role. He is an accident of an accident of an accident. He's a very minor thing. Less even than ships, I would say. But still, if you go through the poems, there they are.
Well, the other great passage of the horses of Achilles that we Still a little later on in the same, or in the next book. It's in the
That's in book 17. That's where I was making
where
my
the
mistake.
horses
That's book 17.
weeps over when Patroclus is slain. That is one of those passages that again everyone remembers.
Didn't you say John Ruskin said?
Ruskin said he said I think he thought it was the greatest passage in poetry. Period.
Not just Homer.
In all poetry. Yes.
And he was a man who knew all poetry.
Yes, he really did.
Patroclus, of course, was to Achilles what Glaucus was to Sarpedon. We have a Porphyrian proportion here, don't we? That is these great friendships. We were talking a moment ago about how war brings out love. Well, it can bring out love of enemy, but it also can bring out love of friend. That is comrade in arms. The love of Achilles and Patroclus is the most famous love in the secular order, as David and Jonathan are in the Bible. And David, when he laments over the death of Jonathan, actually says, I loved thee above the love of woman, he says. And it's an astonishing phrase. That's how much he loved Jonathan, his friend.
He's like, he says, another self. That's something that's been said often of friends. They are like other selves.
And Achilles and Patroclus, there's such a history of that. Aeneas, of course, carries it on, but not as much. I mean, it's not, he's imitating Homer there, and he really does it almost out of a sense of duty. But I think the next great one is in the Middle Ages with Roland and Olivia, or Oliver, or Roland and Oliver, in the great song of Roland.
Well, there's the two young men, Nissus and Euryalus, at the end of the Aeneid. Two young men who go out and die.
In a way, that's
that
better.
episode is more moving and telling than the friendship of Aeneas for his.
What was his name? See, we can't remember his name. Oh, that's terrible.
He's such a.
We're getting old, you know. But he's almost just a name. He's a stick figure. Aeneas is a trusty best friend. Achilles, right. Achilles, yes.
Faithful Achilles.
Faithful Achilles. But we remember him more as an epithet, faithful Achilles, than we do as a man. But by golly, Patroclus is not remembered that way. Patroclus
Achilles never says anything.
No.
He never. He's so. He's always there, but he never says anything. He when the ships, I noticed, I was just reading.
Of course, maybe Virgil knows what he's doing.
No, he's so.
He's so perfect. He doesn't.
He doesn't have to do anything. When the ships are wrecked, and they're washed up on the beach, the very first thing that anybody does is start a fire. And the person who starts the fire is Achilles.
He's got
there.
the flint.
He gets there with the flint, and he starts the fire. And then when Aeneas goes off to hunt, then Achilles goes with him and carries his arrows and his bow.
He's the perfect caddy. But not in disparagement. That is, I would say perfect. But it's true. He's so unobtrusive and so self-effacing that he doesn't have a life of.
Well, there's no great dramatic moment in the poem where you see the love between the two men. It's always it's not understated. It isn't stated at all. And so you just assume it and take it for granted. But
we'll be talking about Virgil in a few
weeks,
days. But they're so different.
Yeah.
I just had a funny thing. I was looking for a passage in the Iliad just before Mr. Quinn came over, and I was desperately trying to find a passage I wanted to read aloud. And I asked when he got here. I said, "Where is that?" He said, "Oh, that's in the Aeneid." and I blushed because, of course, it's in the Aeneid. It's nothing like Homer. The passage I was looking for was totally different, and it wasn't Homeric at all. Their spirit is very, very different. But well we've talked about a number of things today, and it wouldn't hurt to mention them again, because it seems as if we're wandering so far afield that we're just absolutely without form here at all. But there's a theme. We started out with that idea of the music of the spheres, that there are accidents that hum. That is, that after all, God is present everywhere, but every once in a while, there is an epiphany. That is, he shows forth his presence. God is in the grass, God is in the leaves, God is in this person and that person, but every once in a while he manifests his presence. And he does that in Glaucon, confronting Diomedes. And that moved us on to other moments in the poem. And we got on to this idea that this movement, this relation between the two worlds, the spiritual and the secular, presupposes a wall, but that there are gates within that wall. That is, in our lives, there are these gates, there are these places where suddenly the wall becomes not transparent, but well, you can go through it. I mean, the gate. You could actually die. There is really a moment in poetry where, if you opened that gate, you would die. Now, the poet doesn't open. He gives you the gate is closed. But it is almost there. It is almost there. In fact, poetry is dangerous. I was reading Edwin Arlington Robinson. I'm getting more and more fond of him. I think he's a much greater poet than I ever thought. He's an American poet of the last generation who wrote rather gloomy and dense poems. But he was talking of a man who had ruined his life, which is the subject of most of his poems. I guess he had become an alcoholic and it ruined his life. But at the end of the poem, he says, life has so many doors. It's amazing that he didn't open one of them and go through. He's talking about suicide. That is, now Robinson stops and says, but he didn't, because there's something that says no. Robinson had, there was some God there for Robinson. He knew, I don't know how much of a Christian he was, I don't know much about him, but he certainly did have that ultimate sense that you don't disobey the Ten Commandments. But that was the only reason in this man's life. But he uses that word door. There are so many doors. And I think that's true about poetry. That you come upon these doors. They're the seeing gates. They're everywhere. And we've touched upon a number of them, even down to the nostrils of a horse. I mean, every once in a while in your life, you're walking through life and a horse will rear up and snort, and you suddenly realize that you're not standing anywhere, but you're standing between heaven and hell. There you are. I mean, images come to mind. I remember I was in Rome once, and we had been at St. Peter's, and we walked across that long, it's too large. The people who designed that were Renaissance men. It's not human. That plaza, that great thing, it's too big for human beings to take it in. And we walked and walked and walked. Where the great arms, as they say, come out. That great thing. Was it who designed that? It wasn't Michelangelo, but someone else. And someone great, someone famous. And we walked out, and it was a cold winter day, and it was raining almost the way it is here at the moment out the window. I remember that, and the pavement was slick. And out there are horses still, and carriages where they have coaches to take people sightseeing around the city of Rome. And these old coachmen are there. And I have a vivid image of one of them beating a horse, just beating that horse because he had fallen down. And the horse, he wanted to train that horse and make sure that he'd never do that again. The horse had slipped on the pavement and caved in, and he was beating that horse. And the horse, was snorting and rising up. I can remember that so vividly, coming out of St. Peter's, and looking into God knows what. There was the horse. You can't do that with a car. You cannot do that with a car. Those horses are still there. And those are moments in the memory. Weren't we talking last time about the oranges in Greece?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, we were.
Incidentally, that bothered me. You were saying the Cyclops built walls. Homer says they didn't have any walls.
I thought they built the walls of Troy. Who was it that built the walls of Troy?
Was it the Cyclops?
Well, I thought they did.
Yeah. You're probably right. But they had no walls themselves. You remember Odysseus says about them that they were outlaws. They were people.
Yeah, right. They didn't live in
without
in
walls.
caves. They lived in caves.
But at Tiryns, there was a Cyclopean wall.
It wasn't, of course, for themselves. They were made to do it by
for someone else.
Zeus.
I see.
Yes, it wasn't for themselves.
All that is confused, and incidentally, if you think it's confused in my mind, you just read the thing. The thing is more confused even than I am.
Yes.
Mythology is not Porphyry's tree. You cannot reduce it to an outline.
No, there are great gaps in it. There are great holes in it. You can't make any sense.
It's not consistent.
No.
Not at all. But walls are of immense, to make a pun, because they are immense in themselves, but they are of immense significance. The building of the wall, as I understand it, the last remnant of the Temple of Jerusalem is the Wailing
Wall. That's right.
And
it's all that's left. It's all that's left. It's the last great.
And we know that when that temple is restored from the apocalypse, we know that will be the end of the world. That temple is still, that Wailing Wall is still there. And we are just at that moment in history when, who knows, they may start to rebuild it. And that'll be the end of the whole story. But that wall is still there from the temple that was built by King Solomon himself. And here we are with the walls of Troy. High-towered Troy, mini-towered Troy, the high-walled, those are epithets.
Wall, yes. High-walled
Troy. High-walled Troy. And there's something thrilling. The word thrill is something like the word home. That is, it tries to express the same thing. You're pierced in that case rather than make a sound. But there are moments in your life, as there are moments in history, when the angels whip you like a top and you hum, and you hear high-walled Troy. All the walls of the world are somehow present there. And there is a wall between death and life. But there are gates, too. And,
this whole poem is about those walls. They don't fall here in this poem, but they are going to fall. They're doomed. We know those walls are going to fall at last, and the city will be no more. But before that happens, old Priam comes out from those walls, goes out of those walls.
Through the Scaean gates.
Through the Scaean gates.
He goes through the Scaean gates.
Against everybody's advice. Crazy old man going off to get back the body of Hector out of the camp of the Greeks.
And Achilles, now we started with the great theme of this poem. It's in the very first word of the poem, wrath of Achilles. This whole poem is about anger. It's a war poem, and it's about anger. And it begins with wrath of Achilles. And when Priam comes, that wrath is destroyed.
at last, because it isn't destroyed merely with the killing.
No, he's still there. He hates Hector's body.
Yes.
He not only kills Hector, but he kills him and kills him and kills him. He drags him around the walls again of Troy. He ties them to the back of his chariot, and the horses again, gallop around that. How many miles it must be, like a racetrack, around the walls of Troy, just desecrating, pummeling. We can't find words to describe what he does.
He won't give up the body. He won't bury the body.
That man so much.
And St. Thomas Aquinas uses this. This is his example. It was the example of everyone. But he does actually cite this as his example of cruelty. When he wants to explain what cruelty is,
it's beyond hatred.
He says it's the excess of justice. There's the defect of justice, and there's justice as the golden mean, and then there is the excess of justice. I mean, Achilles had a perfect right to kill his enemy.
Yes.
But he did not have the right.
He's balancing Patroclus.
Yes.
The death of Patroclus.
Patroclus. But you cannot desecrate the body. You can't kill. After you killed him, then you've done all that you can. There's nothing more you can do. And he had a right to kill his enemy. But to desecrate his body, that's going too far. And that's cruelty. And it's
crazy at that moment, really.
It's a kind of madness that's infecting him. He can't get over his anger. It is excessive. And you're in danger of hating Achilles at that moment. You begin this really noble man. You're in danger of actually hating him because of this unspeakable behavior toward his enemy. You can't do that. You have to honor the dead. You have to honor the dead. And Achilles refuses to honor the dead. And it's only when old Priam comes there and astonishes him in his tent that he...
So the old man's audacity is almost like the young man's.
It is.
It's almost like Glaucus.
Yes, it is. Everyone is astonished. He says, big though Priam was, he came in unobserved. He comes into Achilles' tent. He came in unobserved, went up to Achilles, grasped his knees, and kissed his hands.
The murderer.
The terrible man-killing hands that had slaughtered so many of his sons. Not, of course, only Hector, but so many of his sons. Achilles was astounded when he saw King Priam, and so were all his men. They looked at each other in amazement, as people do in a rich noble's hall when a foreigner who has murdered a man in his own country and is seeking refuge abroad bursts in on them like one possessed. It's repeated twice. Achilles was astounded. They looked at each other in amazement as Priam appeared. As Aristotle says, great heroes are not given to wonder very often. It takes a lot to astonish Achilles, but this appearance of this, and especially in his wrath, he is still furious.
In fact, it's almost impossible, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't believe that he could be moved at all away from his anger. Anger, of course, it's true of all of the emotions. Once an emotion gets hold of you, as anger has hold of Achilles, you can't have another emotion. You can't have two emotions at once, two powerful emotions at once. And Achilles is a man in the grip of anger, and suddenly another emotion appears. It's astonishment at the appearance of old Priam.
You can't have another emotion, and you can't have reason.
No.
What do we say? We're driven out of our senses. We're driven out of our wits. We're driven out of ourselves, our very selves. We're possessed by the emotion. It dominates us. And we're carried away. These are the words we use in Achilles. It was all of those things, and yet he was shocked back into reality. Suddenly there's an old man, and he sees his own father somehow in that old man. And thinks about his own death and about the generations again of men.
Priam says had set Achilles thinking of his own father. Of course, he appeals to him. Priam appeals to him as the father of Hector. He appeals to him as his father, and that does make Achilles think of his own father. Something we haven't really heard of at all in the poem. He suddenly thinks of his own father, and it brought him to the verge of tears.
Just an instant shock and a change.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I guess that's it, isn't it? That is, we look in a poem for the great turning point of the poem. We had said that every poem has a crisis. Every poem has a reversal. I suppose this is it.
This is it. Yes. It says,
this is the high point of the whole poem.
Yeah. Taking the old man's hand, he gently put him from him.
See, I mean, the poem is over.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the poem as Achilles' anger, now for the first time we have the word gentle. There it is.
You see it's something in Achilles that you had not seen. Well, you've seen it. You saw it in the tent when he was talking to Patroclus.
Right, and there is one of those magnificent digressions in the middle of the poem. You remember when Odysseus goes to try to persuade Achilles to come back. This is way back, in fact, in the very middle of the poem, maybe book 10,
earlier.
Something like book 10. And he brings along his old teacher,
yes.
Phoenix. And we get a kind of adumbration of this scene because, in fact, it's almost word for word.
Yes.
But it doesn't work. At that moment, Achilles says, well, I love my old teacher and I'll put him up for the night, but I won't be persuaded. I will not agree with him. And so Achilles does not cease from his anger at that point and doesn't come back to fight. But he looks forward to this moment. But, you know, when you talk about story, you talk about plot of something, it all has to do with this thing that you were talking about just a moment ago. That is, there can be no story without a kind of possession. That is, something comes over somebody and sweeps him away from himself. And then everything follows from that. It's love or it's hate or whatever it is. And then there's a moment in the story when the whole thing reverses. And we're restored to order. We're restored to reason. The emotion is put back in its proper structure, in the hierarchy of things. It's not destroyed, but it's put back in its place. And that's what happens so marvelously. Many people have said about the Iliad that it's more perfectly constructed than the Odyssey. The Odyssey is episodic. It deals with a series of stories, and you can find a great turning point in the Odyssey. It does sort of sum up the whole thing, but the Iliad is very dramatic and intense. It builds right from the wrath of Achilles to this moment. You can read the Iliad in one night.
Yeah.
You can't read the Odyssey in one night. The Odyssey almost forces
you. It loses its force if you try to read it in one night. This poem gathers force as you read it because it's so intense. It is like a fire. And and it's all over here in a few lines. Really, it's really 20 or 30 lines, and the whole poem is over, and then it goes into a kind of peace comes over the whole poem. We're looking forward now to the burial of Hector. That's the last. This poem ends with the funeral, the flames of the funeral pyre of Hector at the very end of the poem, but. A peace comes to Achilles himself. He's restored to himself, and he understands. A great understanding comes over him. Achilles weeps for his father. Priam weeps, and he weeps. And then it says that presently, when he had had enough of tears and recovered his composure, the excellent Achilles leapt from his chair, and in compassion for the old man's gray head and gray beard, took him by the arm and raised him. Then he spoke to him from his heart. You are indeed a man of sorrows, and have suffered much.
The translator, of course, knows the Bible.
Yeah,
He knows the Bible.
Yeah, he's put that phrase.
But it's good.
That isn't there. You are a man of sorrows.
But it's good. It's good.
It is. It's very suitable.
Because again, in a way, it's a mysterious prophecy of Christ.
Yeah. How could you dare to come by yourself to the Achaean ships, into the presence of a man who has killed so many of your young sons? You have a heart of iron, he says. You have a heart of iron, but pray be seated now, here on this chair, and let us leave our sorrows, bitter though they are, locked up in our own hearts, for weeping is cold comfort and does no good. And he utters again very famous lines. We men are wretched things, and gods who have no cares themselves have woven sorrow into the very pattern of our lives. It takes you back to that scene, that scene we started with.
See, we said that scene was a digression,
yeah.
But it's right on the major theme, isn't it, of the whole poem. And there's a hound down there howling at this moment, almost as if he understands. We have to laugh, those beasts down there. It's almost as if they knew, isn't it? I mean, they're singing some song that animals know about these things. The sky knows it, the rain, the sun, the snow, the earth, the cycle of the seasons and the cycle of the years and the whole history of man. What does he say again? It's a sad story.
He says, yes, he says, it's, leave our sorrows, bitter though they are, locked up in our own hearts, for weeping is cold comfort and does no good. We men are wretched things.
We are wretched things.
And the gods, who have no cares themselves, have woven sorrow into the very pattern of our lives. He says, he goes on, you know that Zeus the Thunderer has 2 jars standing on the floor of his palace.
This is one of those famous figures in
which he
world.
keeps his gifts.
2 jars.
The evils in one, and blessings in the other. People who receive from him a mixture of the 2 have varying fortunes, sometimes good and sometimes bad. Though when Zeus serves a man from the jar of evil only, he makes him an outcast who is chased by the gadfly of despair over the face of the earth, and goes his way damned by gods and men alike. Look at my father, Peleus. From the moment he was born, heaven showered its brightest gifts upon him, fortune and wealth unparalleled on earth, the kingship of the Myrmidons, and though he was a man, a goddess for his wife, yet, like the rest of us, he knew misfortune too.
Those 2 jars, see, there's where you can almost hear Socrates to quote that. He doesn't, but he could have. That is to illustrate all philosophy. And
he does refer to
does he?
Now I can't remember where exactly.
Yeah.
It's quite striking, and I can't think where.
See, that was somewhere in the back of my memory, but I rejected it. I thought maybe I was wrong.
It's in, I don't know, one of those late dialogues. One of those late dialogues.
Yeah. And, when you listen to the sound, I don't know whether the microphone will pick up the sound of those dogs, but, it's a sad song that they sing.
I was thinking the same thing. It's a mournful
song.
Mournful sound.
Yeah. they do know something about the world and about life, and they have nothing to be mournful about at the moment. They're very well fed and well taken care of, but it's as if they did participate in this knowledge. We know what philosophers say about knowledge, that there's no knowledge of the particular, for example, and there's a sensation of it, but there's no science, I should say, of the particular. And we know that animals are not rational creatures, but the poets have an insight into these mysteries. After all, animals are creatures, and creatures do have a kind of knowledge. That is, they participate in existence, and in their animal way, they do understand sorrow.
Well, they have some kind of sorrow. We say
some kind of emotion. It's
animals have emotion.
They
certainly have emotion, and it's based on a kind of. We use the word instinct. They say an instinctive.
But a kind of, especially domestic animals, a kind of love for us.
Oh yeah.
A participation. The horses and the dogs, especially, have an understanding of us. Although it's a terrible thing to watch. They're so helpless with it.